Hello, beautiful people. I'm Oliver Perrin for Semiagog. And today we're going to have a little bit of story time. And it will all sort of illustrate the old saying in Latin, nihil sub sole novum. There is nothing new under the sun. Now, before I jump into reading you this passage, which I will describe in just a moment and contextualize, I would like to remind all of you that I have a Twitter account. Please sign up to catch updates and tweets concerning things that are more time sensitive than can be addressed with this video format that requires the time of shooting and editing and rendering and uploading and all of that before I can get it out there on the YouTube channel. And also because I've had some issues with subscribers. If you wish to be subscribed, please double check to make sure that you are, and perhaps even go so far as to click the little bell icon to receive notifications for my channel. Now, what I'm going to read to you in this clip is a short, I think, short passage out of Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War. Now, why am I going to read this stuff from old dead white guys? Why am I going to read something from the pale patriarchal penis people, the evil peas? I'm going to do so because, as I said, there is nothing new under the sun, and this passage illustrates it beautifully. And it also shows why an education in the classics of the sort, for example, that you can obtain by attending St. John's College, why an education in the classics is so important. And it is precisely this point. There really is nothing new in the human experience, not in any essential sense. So what I'm going to read you is this passage by Thucydides, who was an Athenian, writing in the 5th century BC, that is the 400s BC or BCE. And in this passage, he's describing issues surrounding civil war. And I think all of this is very much to the point with the sort of things that we are dealing with today. Now, just a brief bit of context. I'm not going to go into this much at all because it's not necessary for the passage to really carry its message. But just to let you know the barest outline, the Peloponnesian War stretched over years, and it was basically a result of the conflict between Sparta and its allies and Athens and its allies. Now, the Spartans had a aristocratic form of government, a pair of kings, and if I remember correctly, a 28-member council of elders. So they had a heavy focus on the law, a heavy focus on traditions. And the Athenians had pushed in their democracy and had made tributaries of any number of other states by basically fomenting the rise of democratic parties in any of these or many of these other states that they took control over. They fomented the rise of democratic parties there and thereby destabilized existing orders and brought them under the Athenian umbrella. So the Athenians and the Spartans, often through their allies and their proxies, were at war for a period of years, and this really devastated Greece. But in this passage, Thucydides is talking about the Corcyraeans, which were a group of people that were allies of Athens. And the Spartans, in this case, put their support behind a group of people who were trying to boot out the growing sort of democratic group that wanted to ally with Athens. And this ended up creating all kinds of problems for the Corcyraeans. So again, I'm not going to go into heavy detail because it's not necessary here. All you need to know is that at the point where this passage takes up the narrative, the Corcyraeans have been fighting amongst themselves, the parties that were in support of Sparta and the parties that were in support of Athens. And for a time, it looked like the parties that were in support of Sparta were going to win the day. But then a fleet came to support the ones who were in favor of democracy, a fleet sent by Athens. And at this point, it became, everything started to look rather bad for the ones supporting Sparta. And here is the passage that I wanted to read for all of you. When the Corcyraeans realized that the Athenian fleet was approaching and that their enemies had gone, they brought the Messenians, who had previously been outside the walls, into the city and ordered the fleet which they had manned to sail around into the Helaic harbor. While it was doing so, they seized upon all their enemies whom they could find and put them to death. They then dealt with those whom they had persuaded to go on board the ships, killing them as they landed. Next, they went to the temple of Hera and persuaded about 50 of the suppliants there to submit to a trial. They then condemned every one of them to death. Seeing what was happening, most of the other suppliants, who had refused to be tried, killed each other there in the temple. Some hanged themselves on the trees, and others found various other ways of committing suicide. During the 7 days that Eurymedon stayed there with his 60 ships, this is the Athenian leader and his fleet that was supporting the democratic Corcyraeans, the Corcyraeans continued to massacre those of their own citizens whom they considered to be their enemies. Their victims were accused of conspiring to overthrow the democracy. But in fact, men were often killed on grounds of personal hatred, or else by their debtors, because of the money that they owed. There was death in every shape and form. And, as usually happens in such situations, people went to every extreme and beyond it. There were fathers who killed their sons. Men were dragged from the temples or butchered on the very altars. Some were actually walled up inside the temple of Dionysius and died there. So savage was the progress of this revolution, and it seemed all the more so because it was one of the first which had broken out. Later, of course, practically the whole of the Hellenic world was convulsed with rival parties in every state. Democratic leaders trying to bring in the Athenians, and oligarchs trying to bring in the Spartans. In peacetime, there would have been no excuse and no desire for calling them in. But in time of war, when each party could always count upon an alliance, which would do harm to its opponents and at the same time strengthen its own position, it became a natural thing for anyone who wanted a change of government to call in help from the outside. In the various cities, these revolutions were the cause of many calamities, as happens and always will happen while human nature is what it is, though there may be different degrees of savagery, and as different circumstances arise, the general rules will admit of some variety. In times of peace and prosperity, cities and individuals alike follow higher standards because they are not forced into a situation where they have to do what they do not want to do. But war is a stern teacher. In depriving them of the power to easily satisfy their daily wants, it brings most people's minds down to the level of their actual circumstances. So revolutions broke out in city after city, and in places where the revolutions occurred late, the knowledge of what had happened previously in other places caused still new extravagances of revolutionary zeal, expressed by an elaboration in the methods of seizing power and by unheard of atrocities in revenge. To fit in with the change of events, words, too, had to change their usual meanings. What used to be described as a thoughtless act of aggression was now regarded as the courage one would expect to find in a party member. To think of the future and wait was merely another way of saying one was a coward. Any idea of moderation was just an attempt to disguise one's unmanly character. Ability to understand a question from all sides meant that one was totally unfitted for action. Fanatical enthusiasm was the mark of a real man, and to plot against an enemy behind his back was perfectly legitimate self-defense. Anyone who held violent opinions could always be trusted, and anyone who objected to them became a suspect. To plot successfully was a sign of intelligence, but it was still cleverer to see that a plot was hatching. If one attempted to provide against having to do either, one was disrupting the unity of the party and acting out of fear of the opposition. In short, it was equally praiseworthy to get one's blow in first against someone who was going to do wrong, and to denounce someone who had no intention of doing any wrong at all. Family relations were a weaker tie than party membership, since party members were more ready to go to any extreme for any reason whatsoever. These parties were not formed to enjoy the benefits of the established laws, but to acquire power by overthrowing the existing regime. And the members of these parties felt confidence in each other not because of any fellowship in a religious communion, but because they were partners in crime. If an opponent made a reasonable speech, the party in power, so far from giving it a generous reception, took every precaution to see that it had no practical effect. Revenge was more important than self-preservation, and if pacts of mutual security were made, they were entered into by the two parties only in order to meet some temporary difficulty, and remained in force only so long as there was no other weapon available. When the chance came, the one who first seized it boldly, catching his enemy off guard, enjoyed a revenge that was all the sweeter from having been taken, not openly, but because of a breach of faith. It was safer that way, it was considered, and at the same time a victory won by treachery gave one a title for superior intelligence. And indeed, most people are more ready to call villainy cleverness than simple-mindedness honesty. They are proud of the first quality and ashamed of the second. Love of power, operating through greed and through personal ambition, was the cause of all of these evils. To this must be added the violent fanaticism which came into play once the struggle had broken out. Leaders of parties in the cities had programs which appeared admirable. On one side, political equality for the masses. On the other, safe and sound government of the aristocracy. But in professing to serve the public interest, they were seeking to win the prizes for themselves. In their struggles for ascendancy, nothing was barred. Indeed, terrible were the actions to which they committed themselves, and in taking revenge, they went farther still. Here they were deterred neither by the claims of justice, nor by the interests of the state. Their one standard was the pleasure of their own party at that particular moment. And so, either by means of condemning their enemies on an illegal vote or by violently usurping power over them, they were always ready to satisfy the hatreds of the hour. Thus, neither side had any use for conscientious motives. More interest was shown in those who could produce attractive arguments to justify some disgraceful action. As for the citizens who held moderate views, they were destroyed by both the extreme parties, either for not taking part in the struggle, or in envy at the possibility that they might survive. As a result of these revolutions, there was a general deterioration of character throughout the Greek world. The simple way of looking at things, which is so much the mark of a noble nature, was regarded as a ridiculous quality and soon ceased to exist. Society had become divided into two ideologically hostile camps, and each side viewed the other with suspicion. As for ending this state of affairs, no guarantee could be given that would be trusted, no oath sworn that people would fear to break. everyone had come to the conclusion that it was hopeless to expect a permanent settlement. And so, instead of being able to feel confident in others, they devoted their energies to providing against being injured themselves. Now, this last passage, I want to make very sure, seats itself in your attention and perhaps even in your memory, because these last words are words worth heeding. As a rule, those who were least remarkable for intelligence showed the greater powers of survival. Such people recognized their own deficiencies and the superior intelligence of their opponents. Fearing that they might lose a debate or find themselves outmaneuvered in intrigue by their quick-witted enemies, they boldly launched straight into action. While their opponents, overconfident in the belief that they would see what was happening in advance, and not thinking it necessary to seize by force what they could secure by policy, were the more easily destroyed because they were off their guard. Now, this is an old book. I can't even count the number. I can't even reckon the number of people who must have read it across history. It's been around for quite some time. But as I said before, there is nothing new under the sun. Now, for those of you who might be wondering why I just went to the trouble of reading you a passage that's instructive, a passage that is a kind of warning regarding the perils of civil war, why I just read you a passage that's more than 2,000 years old about the perils of internecine strife and conflict. Well, men and women of the West, I would say to you, look around you. Get it? Got it? Good. Semiagog out.